Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing my journey with the Brontës. So I did a video like this last year about Thomas Hardy. I'll link that down below if you're curious about it. And I thought this year it would be fun to go over another favorite author or group of authors of mine, and that's the Brontës. I'm gonna be honest, I did not prepare for this video hardly at all. I don't know why, I just wasn't ever feeling inspired to know how to put this together, so I'm really just going to be going through my experience, and it's kind of going to be me just gushing and chatting about the Brontës, so hopefully you'll enjoy it. Also, I apologize if you can hear my washer. It's kind of loud but quiet enough that you might not be able to hear it on here, but if you do, I apologize for that. Anyway, let's just get started. So first of all, the very first book I ever read by the Brontës maybe honestly wasn't the best place to start if I'm being totally honest, but it was Wildering Heights by Emily Brontë. So the most controversial, I feel like, of all of the Brontë novels was the first one I read. And to show how controversial it is, I will say that I read this for a class. It was our summer reading for that class before we actually started the class. And I hated it when I first read it. I really didn't like it. However, once we got to class and started discussing it, I found myself falling in love with the story and the characters and recognizing a lot of the greatness of the story. And to this day, Heathcliff is one of my favorite characters to consider and think about. Just, he's so complex. He's like the original Professor Snape, in my opinion, and he's just fascinating. The atmosphere created in this book is so beautiful. I will say, after a few years, I did reread this because of my experience, because I read it and didn't like it, but then discussing it, I liked it. I wanted to reread it and see how it went now that I had more of an appreciation for the characters. And I did find there was a portion of the story that is a bit slow for me. I'm going to be rereading this again. I'm going to listen to it on audiobook this year, and so we'll see how that impacts my feelings. But it is one that I really love, I look at with fondness, and I'm honestly excited to listen to on audiobook because it's just such an atmospheric story that I feel like an audiobook will be a really great experience with this one. Then a few months after I read Wildering Heights and we discussed it in class, I ended up reading for that same class, although this one wasn't necessarily a required reading. It was one I just decided to read. Also, sorry about the changing lighting. It's really windy and there's a tree right outside my window, and so it keeps periodically coming closer to my window, so it darkens it a little bit. But anyway, we're going to just keep going. So yes, a few months after I finished Wildering Heights, I read for that class Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, and this one I actually ended up at the time liking less than Wildering Heights. I liked a lot about it, but I was still early on in my classics reading, and so I think I was still struggling with the language a little bit, and it made it difficult to really fall into this. Plus, we didn't end up discussing this in class, which I always think discussion, especially about classics, helps to improve your attitude to a book a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time I found that to be the case. And so I feel like Jane Eyre suffered from my inexperience with classics and the fact that I didn't have that discussion with it. So Wildering Heights I was able to discuss and really develop that love for, whereas I didn't with this one. That being said, I still gave it 4 stars to start off with and really enjoyed it a lot. It just didn't really grab me the way it grabs a lot of other people. Fast forward to currently, I am listening to the audiobook for this, and I'm hoping to finish, so I'm filming this before October starts, and I'm almost done with this audiobook, so I'm hoping I finish it in October, even if it's October 1st that I finish it. So I'm kind of trying to spread out my listening a little bit for the rest of the week. But anyway, I am loving this so much more this time. It's definitely going to be a 5 stars. I really love it. I don't know if it's better than Wildering Heights or not. At this point, I honestly might say I do like it better than Wildering Heights. However, I will see once I reread Wildering Heights if that changes. But anyway, really loving this. It's just, over time, I've grown in my classics reading, and I've just come to really appreciate a lot of what this book is doing, the atmosphere that's created, Charlotte Bronte's language in this story, Jane as a character is so incredible, and I just have learned to love this. So it did start off being not great, but it's ending up being one of my favorite Victorian novels. So at that point, I found myself enjoying the Brontes and had an interest in them, but I wasn't necessarily totally enthralled by them yet. But it was a really good opener to both my experience with the Brontes and my experience really with Victorian literature as a whole. Those were some of the first books in Victorian literature I've ever read. Then, as I've mentioned before, I went on my mission and returned in 2018, beginning of 2018. And at that point, I really found this inspiration to want to read a lot more classics. So after watching some BookTube, getting some recommendations, seeing what people read from the Brontes, what they thought about the Brontes, I ended up deciding to pick up the Tenet of Wildville Hall by Anne Brontë because I had not read anything by Anne yet. So I decided to pick this up. I actually read this when I went on a trip, and it was so great to read while in the car. There was a lot of driving on that trip just because we were going to around the state of Michigan. So we were going to several different cities around, and I had a lot of time to read in the car. And this book solidified my love of the Brontes by far. I absolutely loved this story. I loved the messages that were in it. I loved the characters. It was the first time I ever experienced any level of attraction to any of the Bronte heroes. I just found myself falling in love with the story and found a fascination with Anne. There was just something in her writing that spoke to her soul almost. That sounds so dramatic, but really there's something in all the Brontes' work, I would say, that really shows me that they were writing with their hearts so much. And I think that's what's so compelling about the Brontes' work and about them as people. The more you learn about them as people, the more you recognize what they were doing with their books, that they really were putting their heart and soul into their stories. And I just absolutely love that aspect of the Brontes' novels. And this one just spurred on, like I said, my love of the Brontes and made me want to read everything that they had ever written. So at that point, I decided that was what I was going to do. And within several months, I ended up picking up Agnes Gray by Anne Brontë, which is my favorite Bronte novel. Absolutely adore it. And Anne, I've mentioned before, is my favorite Bronte sister, again, because I just feel like she puts her soul so much into her stories. And she just, even when I learn about her life, we only know so much about her because she died so young, and we just don't have a lot of information, especially about her and Emily. But you can just see she's just a sweet spirit and yet so strong. And I was able to see that a lot in this story. I really related to Agnes as a character, and to this day it's still my favorite of the Bronte novels. I just absolutely adore it. I really want to reread it soon because it's just so sweet and powerful, just experiencing Agnes's experiences as a governess, and also just her romance and just her exploring herself and finding independence is such a beautiful story. So from then on, we continued, and at that point I was like, well, all I have left are Charlotte's novels. So that was my new project, was to get through all the rest of Charlotte's novels. Then later that same year, for Victober, which was just this last year actually, I ended up reading Shirley by Charlotte Brontë, and unfortunately this one was a huge letdown. I really didn't like this book. There were aspects to it that I did like, and it actually did make me tear up at points. So definitely my emotional investment was there. But on the whole, there was just nothing particularly memorable about it for me. I found the plot to be really boring and dragged a lot. I didn't really much care for any of the characters, and it just wasn't what I hoped it would be, especially because I know Lucy the reader loves this book. It just wasn't for me, and so I was a little disappointed at that, and have gone into the rest of Charlotte Bronte's books not expecting a lot, just because I really was not impressed by this. It was one of my most disappointing reads of last year. But that didn't stop me, and earlier this year I ended up picking up Villette, which I did like more than Shirley, not as much as any of the other books, but I still enjoyed it. I know a lot of people really hate this book. In fact, I read it with Naomi from Naomi's Bookshelf, and she despised it. But I saw a lot of charm in the story. I really found it interesting to read alongside the huge Brontë biography by Juliet Barker that I read also earlier this year, which continued to develop my love for the family of the Brontës, not just the sisters, but also Branwell and their father Patrick. It was so fun to get to know them through that biography, and especially reading this alongside it was very interesting just because this is Charlotte's most autobiographical novel, and I could definitely see that when reading the Brontë biography. I was able to recognize a lot of Charlotte's tendencies and personality in this book, which frankly I don't love Charlotte as a person. I mean, I like a lot about her and I find her very fascinating. I don't hate her, but I do think she has a few more flaws that grate personally on my nerves a little bit more than her sisters, especially Anne. But that being said, I did find it really interesting to see how much Lucy Snowe represented the author herself, and I found that really, yeah, it was just an enjoyable experience to read. And frankly, I honestly enjoyed the romance that ended up happening in this, not necessarily because I liked the guy or necessarily because I think they were both good people. I just think they complemented each other pretty well. And the ending, I still don't know how I feel about it, but there are things I like about it, certainly, and there are things I don't for sure as well. So anyway, I did enjoy this more. Wasn't great, but I enjoyed it more. And now all I have left to read is The Professor by Charlotte Brontë, and I've heard this is similar to Villette, just from the man's perspective. I'm not sure how I'll feel about it, but I'm excited to see, and then at that point I'll have read all of the Brontë novels, which in some ways is kind of sad just because I have enjoyed them so much. But I can always reread them. I'm excited to reread Anne's novels in particular because I just love them. Absolutely, and it's been an interesting trend of my affection for the Brontës because it definitely started out being like I was intrigued but I wasn't in love, whereas Hardy I quickly fell in love with, especially because we started with Tess of the D'Urbervilles for that, and that's one of my favorite books of all time. So absolutely loved Hardy pretty early on, but the Brontës just sort of piqued my curiosity, and then over time I've come to really fall in love with them, both between reading their books, reading about them, and then just hearing them talked about on BookTube. There's something about hearing them discussed on BookTube, really hearing any books discussed on BookTube, that I feel like really lifts your appreciation for them in a lot of ways, and I definitely have found that with the Brontës. So that's another great thing about BookTube, I suppose, one of the blessings that have come to me through BookTube. And I'm excited to see how my affection and feelings towards each of these books develops over time, if it changes much, if it stays the same. Later on this year I will be doing a ranking of all of the Brontë novels, so stay tuned for that if you're curious. But yeah, they're just wonderful, wonderful stories. And the authors themselves were also very interesting people and had very interesting lives. Their lives were very simple, and yet there's just something about them that almost resembles their stories that makes them that much more intriguing. And it's just, I really appreciate the Brontës as a whole. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Let me know down below your favorite Brontë novel. I would love to know what you think of the Brontës in general. Any thoughts you have on anything I said, feel free to let me know. Be sure to like and subscribe if you would like to. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!